Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff with the German Marshall Fund. Thank you for coming on to this immediate, I would call it a blitz event, as we have several these days in these unusual times. Thank you for being flexible. Also, thank you for being flexible to our panel here tonight. So the reason for us coming together is a session, an extraordinary session of the German Parliament yesterday morning on a Sunday that was not extraordinary only because it was on a Sunday morning because of its content. Many of you will have heard that announcements were made by Chancellor Scholz that represent a major course correction of this country's foreign and security policy in the face of Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine. But it is about much more than just about defense spending. In order to explain the content and the context of all of this, I would like to introduce to you three speakers tonight. Metin Hakverdi, member of Parliament, was in the chamber yesterday. Daniela Schwarzer, the Open Society Foundation's formerly one of my predecessors in my current office, and also a former director of the German Council on Foreign Relations. Last but certainly not least, State Secretary Mark Speich, who was also in the chamber yesterday as a representative of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. So we have two firsthand experiences here. So what I would like to do in the course of this conversation is not to have opening statements, but we have agreed to do a little conversation here, and then ask you to use either raise the hand or use the Q&A function to write a question into the chat. We have about 200 participants right now, so please use the chat for me to see your question. I want to start with Mr. Speich, who, as I mentioned, was in the chamber and was following what we consider a historic session already today. Many people interpret this as what the newspapers say. Tell us a little bit about the setting and the atmosphere in the chamber. Was this expected? At what point did you actually realize this was going to be not your ordinary session?
Thank you very much. I think it was clear from the beginning when the whole plenary rose to give standing ovations to the Ukrainian ambassador, which is really extraordinary. I mean, you have to know that there's a kind of informal code of conduct that the government bench and the Länder bench never give applause because it's really restricted to the members of parliament, but all the benches stood up and applauded. Of course, it was to the brave people of Ukraine, but it was also to the brave ambassador, I mean, who really rallied for the cause of Ukraine for months. And he was seen at times as a pain in the neck in the Chancellery and in other official institutions, but he never gave up. And I think we all know he was right to do so. The second moment was, of course, when Chancellor Scholz announced the setup of a defense fund of 100 billion, and with that clearly marking a fundamental return of German politics on that. So that was I would say, a revolution in German politics. In a way, it was a very late response to a speech that Federal President Gauck gave 2014 at the Munich Security Conference, where he called for more German responsibility in geopolitics. But that's, I think, a topic you, Thomas, know much more about. That was really a real turning point for me.
President was in the room as well, and following this moment right next to the Ukrainian ambassador. Daniela Schwarzer, for all of those on the other side of the Atlantic or outside of Germany, yes, we understand there is going to be a dramatic increase in defense spending, as I understand is going to be 30% in this year alone. But there's much more to this. Help our audience please understand what the scope and what the content and what the different dimensions of this, of what was proposed and announced yesterday are.
Well, first of all, thank you, Thomas, for having me. Very pleased to be part of this conversation. Really, at a point in time where I still felt strange waking up this morning and thinking, wow, German foreign policy really changed over the weekend. And look, what's this new reality now? So I think it's important to see that there was a run-up to Sunday's speech, and Germany was under pressure to take a number of decisions, first on energy, and I think in the transatlantic context, the most discussed issue was Nord Stream 2. And yeah, days before the big speech, the government decided, when Russia invaded Ukraine, to put the project on hold. And that was the first signal that really something was changing, because for years, really, consecutive governments had tried to frame this as a business project with no bigger political and strategic implications. And of course, energy provisions in particular from Russia, and in this particular context, were obviously of political and strategic relevance, not only for Germany, but also for our eastern neighbors. So that was the first move. The second move was on arms exports. That was Friday night, that the government said it would deliver defensive arms to Ukraine. A big move, because we have laws in place that actually don't make it easy, not impossible as we have seen, but make it difficult to deliver arms to conflict zones. Certain conditions have to be met. And it takes a tremendous political will to actually say, we break our good tradition of not delivering arms to conflict zones. And why did it happen? Simply because I think from a moral, from a security, and from a political perspective, it was increasingly difficult for Germany to be a bystander from the perspective of many in this question of how do we strengthen Ukraine militarily. And the ambassador who was mentioned, he was tireless in actually reminding Germans how important it would be that Germany also would participate in delivering arms to Ukraine. I wish to say at that point that it's not that Germany is at all disengaged from Ukraine, but it's actually, next to the US, one of the biggest single donors, both individually, but then also through EU packages. So it's not that Germany turned away from the Ukraine as such. It just, until last Friday, did not think that military support was adequate. So this changed too. And then the big speech, I think the essential piece was already mentioned, the defense fund, but there was also something else. There was on defense still a very clear commitment to nuclear sharing, and also a very strong commitment to European defense cooperation. Our Chancellor explicitly mentioned France and said, we have to move forward with European defense projects. And those who know in detail about where they stand, they know some of them are really hitting, obstacles and are not advancing as planned. So this was a strong political commitment at a point in time where some have said, oh, wow, our approach to Franco-German, but also European defense cooperation hasn't quite delivered as easily as we thought. So here was a strong push on that. But also, as I said, on the transatlantic dimension. The final, well, I want to make two more points. One is on energy. So he course corrected also on one of, in my view, the previous strategic failures of the German government, in particular in the Merkel years after the annexation of Crimea, to actually decrease German energy dependence on Russia. After 2014, when Crimea got annexed, there was so much talk in the EU, including in Germany, about energy security and how we can diversify sources. And while some things were done, we know that part of the reasons why Germany was hesitant on certain sanction packages, including the exclusion from SWIFT, is the strong import dependency on Russian gas. And so this was also not immediately corrected, but Scholz announced the construction of 2 LNG terminals, which will help, but then also a strong commitment to pushing forward with investing into renewable energies. So we'll see how quickly this pans out, but at least there was an explicit recognition that in order to reach space for a stronger policy vis-a-vis Russia, Germany has to work on its energy dependency. So it was a course correction, interestingly, by a social democratic chancellor on Russia policy. And final point, the whole framing of the Ukraine conflict that Scholz chose really put the whole conflict into a much larger dimension. He said, this is not, in a way, I mean, I'm now saying it in my own words, but he said, yes, we have to support Ukraine. But the bigger issue is we are in a fight for democracy and freedom on the European continent. And he clearly positioned Germany as a leader in that fight with all the means. We discussed military means. There's the other support, that financial support that Germany gives to Ukraine, but also this very strong political commitment. And he not only said Germany commits to freedom and democracy on the European continent, but also really, really strongly said, in my words again, as Germany becomes a stronger actor on defense and security, it totally commits to doing this in the framework of the EU, which needs to work together more closely, and secondly, NATO. So the old reflex here is still there, and I think it's right to emphasize that Germany intends to continue to work through its alliances and the deeply integrated EU. And I think that is frankly the only way to make it feasible for our partners to work well with a Germany that in the future will be a stronger player on security and defense. Thanks.
Daniela, is it fair to say that Sunday, 11 o'clock, the country decided to take on Vladimir Putin?
I think that was the moment we learned that the Chancellor had decided this. It kind of transpired over the previous days, but this was a very clear decision to draw lines where he cannot go. To the sanction decisions the night before and the day before, already the German commitment to that means Germany is ready to bear costs. And then what he said on energy and what he said on defense is a serious additional investment that the government will make. The money has to come from somewhere. So there will be sacrifices in other parts, and there will also be quite an interesting discussion on funding, budget rules, debt breaks, and so on. So I think this all in all is a real broad shift, which Germany, in my view, had to do. Russia triggered this, but it's really going back to what Mark Speich said on the continuity to the 2014 Gauck moment, where it was about German responsibility, German engagement, and also, in a way, the question that was around for the next years, does Germany put money where the mouth is? And I think what we saw on Sunday was a very clear commitment to do that.
Metin Hakverdi, you were in the chamber. You are a social democrat. This is your chancellor, this is your government. Take me into the process that led up to this, to the degree that you followed these last hours, but maybe the run-up to this. Help us understand the thought process that led to this very un-German shift. We're a country of gradualism. This is probably the biggest shift in policy that I've seen in a long time, maybe in my life. Maybe in some version, this is a security policy Fukushima. I don't know how to even compare it, but take me into the inner workings of social democracy on this issue.
You asked me about Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, and social democracy. First of all, thanks for having me here in this venue. It is it was a historic moment. It was a historic moment, but it was not only a moment for social democracy and Olaf Scholz. Obviously, this speech was followed by other speeches as well. So Mrs. Baerbock spoke, Mr. Habeck, and of course Mr. Lindner, and it is a government approach with all the three parties, which are also a new combination in coalition history of Germany. So a lot of new things are happening at the same time, but obviously the most important thing that happened was the attack of the Russian Federation on Ukraine, which, and I'm still interpreting this, okay? Don't expect me to have all the historic framework interpreted to 100% day after, but what the special moment was made out, from my perspective, was that not too many new things, individual little things were discussed newly in that speech. The energy question was on the table for a long time. The support for Ukraine, whether economically or by weapon delivery, was also before the speech as an issue. The support of NATO territory before Sunday was also obviously an issue. And of course, the technical detail of 100 billion euros in a special fund is just seen for itself, isolated, is a financial commitment. And obviously, Mr. Lindner was addressed personally in the speech because of this, because obviously it has a financial budget commitment to that, which needed to be explained, that where it needed to be explained that the whole coalition would be into this. No, the special thing was to put this all together in a very special moment, to speak to the people of Germany, to speak to our allies, to speak to the Ukrainian people, and of course to speak to the Kremlin at the same time. And that made it so dense and unique. And at the very beginning, Olaf Scholz said what the speech is about. It's that the world will not be the same afterwards. With all the comments that were within the last weeks, months, and even years about the communication skills and tasks of Mr. Scholz, you know, he's from Hamburg, like I am, and I've been knowing him for years. I was not so surprised that some other members of the Social Democratic Party, that he's in demanding situations, he's able to work this out. But this was truly a super important moment where he managed to put this all into one act of communication. Obviously, it was very well operatively worked on within the coalition. It was too detailed not to do so. So it wasn't just a one-man speech without any work between the parties before that. Everybody was knowing what he was doing at that time. So and he was right. He was right. The world is not the same, not only because of the attack on Ukraine, but also because the Social Democratic Party, being the party that is which the Chancellor at this point, and this very important point, is a member of, would have to accept as well that the world has changed.
But what does this, you said everybody knew it. It seemed from following it on television that many in the German Bundestag didn't know this was coming. The surprise in the chamber seemed palpable. Was it a surprise to many of even the Social Democratic caucus? Because this has been prepared, but the events unfolding since the invasion have been so fast-paced that I imagine the coordination is in a small coalition circle. So it seemed to me that there must have been dynamics going on in social democracy itself.
So you're talking about the 100 billion euro fund.
I'm not just talking about that. There is a a course correction of Russia policy. There's a course correction of energy policy vis-a-vis Russia, and there's a course correction of defense policy with large implications on numerous foreign policy issues as well. So take me into the chamber and your conversation with your colleagues.
Well, first of all, there is no difference between the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberals at this point. So in details of that speech, maybe, don't quote me on this one, but maybe a dozen people in the room knew what was coming in detail in that speech. Maybe a dozen. So with all the outcomes, that was a surprising and leading speech. But I tried to give you an explanation of what happened the hours, the days, and the month before this speech. But it was surprising for everybody, I would say, for almost everybody in the room, to put this all into just one speech with all the implication it had in that special moment. So yes, you're right. We will. I think the interpretation is correct to say that Germany, by the speech of its chancellor, decided to take more responsibility. And maybe the biggest difference to the past is not that it was said, but that in the eyes of in the ears of the listeners, it was believed that Olaf Scholz and the government really means it this time. Maybe that's one of the biggest differences and biggest changes. The severeness of the speech, the seriousness of the speech. We have been talking in the past about the differences between Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Scholz, and maybe what they have in common. This was his moment, and it was his moment because he is believed in what he said. It is a policy shift. We see that not only for budget spending, as you probably know, when you are me being a member of the budget committee, knowing that there are a lot of technical issues to be solved on this way, but the greater line out has changed. We feel responsible not only for the security of our own country, but the security of Europe. What helps is, I looked this up before you asked me to be here tonight. If you look at the Twitter account of the Olaf Scholz, because Olaf Scholz is on Twitter, the Bundeskanzler is on Twitter now for a week now, he used the opportunity to Twitter in English language, which is obviously also, well, a lot of head of states are communicating not only in their home language, but also in English. But there was even an addition to that speech afterwards, just a few hours after Sunday afternoon, and it was he said, "We will never accept the use of force as a political instrument. We will not rest until peace in Europe is secured." If you've asked me a week ago, I would say those are words of the U.S. president and not of the German chancellor. So. That is what is the big change. We feel responsible, we take the responsible, and we are not, and we are accepting that fact that we are living in a new world. And yes, before you ask me that, Thomas, some would argue that world has changed a few years ago, and we are late on that run. Yeah, that might be the truth, but it was very, very impressive how a German government declared to be themselves responsible for peace in Europe in that form yesterday.
Max Speich, the opposition was on board. The opposition leader of the conservative opposition, mainstream conservative opposition, declared his support. I'm asking you this question because, of course, you represent, to explain to our listeners, a state in the second chamber that is governed by conservatives. So I'm asking you a little bit about the intra-party dynamics, if you can, to explain how mainstream conservatism has responding to this and will be cooperating or opposing elements of what is yet to unfold in the parliamentary process.
Would you allow me an additional observation regarding the governing parties before I turn to the opposition?
Absolutely.
Because I think what is interesting that each of the parties, I mean, they were absolutely united in the position, so I'm not challenging that. But I think the turning point for each of the parties was slightly different. So I think for the SPD, at least from my perspective, I mean, the attitude towards Russia, at least for parts of the party, really was a major turning point. The Greens were always much clearer on that before that, but their attitude to hard power was different. So that was really a change I saw here. I mean, really supporting a defense fund, that is a major step for the Greens. And with the FDP, with the Liberals, I mean, taking on huge debt is also a turning point for a matter of, even if it is a matter of national security. So there is a united position of the government, but there were slightly different approaches to this historic moment. I just wanted to share this observation. Now coming to the opposition, I mean, there is a tradition that the conservatives, when in opposition, rather support the government when it comes to matters of national security. I mean, you might remember 1981, the Euro missile discussion. I mean, it was the opposition that supported Chancellor Schmidt in that course, whereas parts of his own party and the Greens, whose, well, narrative, founding narrative is anti-nuclear in a double sense, civilian and military use, were opposing that very strongly. So there is this kind of tradition. I think that is also now what we could observe in the Bundestag, and I'm convinced that Friedrich Merz was one of the 12 persons that were mentioned that knew what Chancellor Scholz would announce at that day, because there was a meeting on Saturday night where I think the leaders of the opposition were informed on that. But to really describe the process, there was also a meeting on Friday night of the Chancellor with the state premiers in Germany, and clearly the aim, the objective was to rally them behind the government approach. But at that time, it was clear that there was an assessment of maybe arms delivery, but it was not clear at that time yet. There was still a discussion on SWIFT. So I observed on Saturday morning raising concern among my party colleagues, and you could see that in social media and so on. There was a strong voice for delivering arms, for excluding Russia from SWIFT. So I saw this mounting concern, and then in Saturday afternoon things changed. There was news broke that weapon delivery would be possible. We didn't, of course, know about the defense fund, but it was clear that a change of mind was starting and beginning, and that in a way calmed down again those social media voices within the Conservative Party family. And it was very clear that when in Parliament the Chancellor announced all this, Friedrich Merz clearly declared his support. I mean, you have to know that for the defense fund, probably at least, there will be the need of a constitutional amendment. So you need a 2/3 majority for that in both chambers. And therefore the opposition has, of course, to support this. But I think there is a clear commitment. Of course, I mean, and that's what you also could hear in Friedrich Merz's speech. The opposition wants to get involved in the details, but I guess that's a fair deal if you support the government's position, that you're also involved in the detailed planning. But there is, I think, this general support of the government line is nowhere challenged within the Conservative Party, within the Christian Democratic Party in Germany.
There is a line of questioning in several of our listeners and viewers' comments that I can sum up with the word "I am not convinced," which is when is domestic politics are going to hit this? Is this going to be cut down, cut short, meet opposition? Is the bipartisanship that characterized or the session yesterday, is that going to hold? Or let me add the alternative option. As we operationalize this, could there be more necessary as the war drags on, as necessities arise, as Putin voices more threats? So in which direction do you expect this to go? Anyone, a question to anyone who would like.
Actually, I was thinking the same thing. Has the world really changed? And the answer is yes, it has. So that just technically, there's no way back. But even on talking about the policies that I mentioned in speech, there will be no turning back on the energy policies of the last decades. You will not see Russia coming back to be the #1 supplier of energy resources for Germany. I don't see that without taking, hopefully, I'm not making any future assessments on the outgo of the war in Ukraine, but in all alternatives that are on the table, I don't see that Russia will coming back on the energy issue for us. That we, after the impression this war had left on our allies on the eastern flank of NATO, I don't see that Germany draws out from those countries because some things have changed and because of majority voting within the German parliament. I think that will not, I don't see any alternative to that, strengthening the alliance in the East. On sanctions, that might change depending on the outcome of this conflict, of how the Kremlin decides to deal with this issue, to draw out. At this point, I don't see it at all. We impose super heavy sanctions that, in economic terms, we haven't even seen how devastating they will be for the Russian economy. And the support for the Ukraine, financially, delivering of weapons will not be less in the future. So no, this is the new world. Whether the narrative of Germany taking responsibility for its own security and for the security of Europe will change, that depends on how this chancellor and how this government is supported by the coalition, and in really difficult situations by at least the biggest opposition party. I think in this particular issue, I'm pretty convinced that there's no turning back on this point.
Does anyone have a sense in this panel of whether what we heard yesterday is going to be supported by the German people? Obviously, we have no polls yet, but there may be things that you have heard or a sense that you may have.
If I might come in here, I mean, it was quite symbolic that at the same time where Chancellor Scholz delivered this speech, outside, in front of the Berlin, in the Brandenburg Gate, more than 100,000 people gathered. And it was interesting, of course, I mean, it's anecdotal evidence, but if you saw those people, it was all age groups, it was all party affiliations, well, maybe not the very left and the very right, but the main parties were all represented there. So it was really a broad support, anti-Putin and in favor of the Ukrainian cause. So maybe not on the details of what was delivered in the plenary, but I think there is so much support right at the moment across all brackets of German society, which is completely different than in former national security discussions. I mentioned the Euro missile challenge. I mean, here the population was completely split, and I mean, you saw demonstrations on one side and on the other side. So that's a different situation now. So I really see broad support for that, and I'll hope that it will last, actually.
And
I would agree, and I found it impressive how the demonstrations on the streets have actually built up in parallel to Germany becoming more courageous on its, consecutive decisions regarding Ukraine. And I do think that this will continue, this kind of support for a supportive policy towards Ukraine. And really, if you look at also the social media debate, and there's very little out there that would make me think now, after more than 24 hours after that big speech, something went seriously wrong in conveying the message. And I think let's look at the message again. I mean, it was about Ukraine in the first instance, but it was really about democracy and freedom on our continent. He said that several times, and that's why I thought it was such a big speech and even a historical speech, because he acknowledged that this is under threat and that Germany stands up to the challenge, yes, to help Ukraine, but he spoke about peace and stability in Eastern Europe, which is a big thing to say, because our neighborhood, Eastern Europe, is in many ways under challenge and under threat. And so I think he conveyed a real and honest sense of urgency that something is really seriously at stake, and that it's about our model. It's not about fighting back against Russia only, that is part of it, but it's really an affirmation of what Germany wants to stand for, and then also how it understands its own role in Europe. That's why I found the emphasis in many, sentences throughout the speech of the European dimension very important. And in a way, I think Europe needs that reassurance, because Germany will be the biggest defense spender in Europe by far if all this is really put into place. And that will shift power relationships, particularly between Germany and France.
And as you're talking about Europe, what do you think will be the ripple effects on Europe, if there are any?
Well, one thing is I felt that over the past, let's say, 3-4 days, there was very close cooperation between, the governments through the various and very frequent European, council meetings, ministerial council meetings, European council meetings, so the heads of state and government getting together. And only these series of meetings and this sort of very close coordination allowed so many decisions to come through in just 48 hours. We didn't yet speak about the interior ministers meeting, which also happened on the weekend, which took an important decision as well. Basically, Ukraine is a country that enjoys visa freedom in Europe, so Ukrainians can come into the EU when they have a biometric passport and formal requirements. They can come in for 90 days, and the decision was taken over the weekend that they can actually stay for 3 years. So a very much simpler process of immigrating. And here again, we saw reactions from countries who, during the previous high time of immigration to the EU, the so-called migration crisis in 2015, were adamantly against acknowledging that we all have to take in refugees. So now there is a stronger sense of solidarity, both with Ukrainians coming, but also among EU member states. So I think, a lot is happening in the EU at the moment, and much discussion has happened on the EU's role as a foreign policy and security actor and defense actor. And we all know that this relies entirely, except for the European Defense Fund, which isn't quite that big, on what the member states will bring and to what extent they will want to coordinate. So I think putting the investment that Germany is ready to make into defense directly into a European logic, both when it comes to armament basically investment into armament projects, procurement, and then also saying that Europe has to be strengthened politically as part of NATO, I think, you know, this is a clear message to allies, but still Germany will now be a more important actor at the table. I mean, right now through the commitment, but once this materializes and we actually have more to deploy, that will change the dynamics between governments who have a strong stake in European security. And I would say that's France, that's obviously the UK outside the EU, that's Poland, and then come others like Italy and Spain and so on. But I think this really changes something for the EU.
There is a nuclear component to this, because I can't see it as a coincidence that Mr. Putin, in the late stages of the parliamentary debate, raised the DEFCON level in reaction to nothing on the battlefield, but in response to Western responses, and that may or may not have included this parliamentary session and what it came out of it.
Mm-hmm.
The threat levels are is significant here in terms of the uneasiness that you feel with multiple actors. Take us into the decision that was taken or announced about nuclear sharing and what that will mean. Maybe Metin Hakverdi.
Well, technically, the coalition treaty is clear on that one, right? So nothing new, but practically, of course, something has changed through the attack on Ukraine. So just to take you to, it depends on your future assessment. So I don't see that this will be forgotten by German public and by German politicians, what we faced in this week and in the weeks before with the military buildup on the border of Ukraine. If we didn't have the protection, the deterrence of the armed forces of the United States of America, this whole game would have been totally changed. This will not be forgotten. So even if things ease up in Ukraine, which I really hope that it will not end in a super big catastrophe, we will not forget what is necessary to take our own security in our own hands. And we were leading this discussion now for years. This will play out now very practically. And this will not also have an effect on us in Germany, but maybe also on other countries in the alliance, not only in Europe, but maybe in the United States. Maybe that will help us. Maybe that will help us in our alliance for future, let's say, populist movements in any NATO country, that we are taking responsibility for us as a whole. So I don't see that there will be turning back from this position, because the reasons to have this position will not fade away in the future.
There is a couple of rather critical questions, or one is more doubting, the other is more critical. The one question is, many of the measures taken will take an effect long term, but the threat by Vladimir Putin can be short term. How is the country going to respond to the likely response of Vladimir Putin? How is it prepared for that? How is the political system prepared for it? And the second question, sort of in this direction, is sort of going from helmets to $100 billion defense fund and sending weapons at the same time. One of our viewers calls the quick road from appeasement to brinksmanship, which raises doubt about how Germany's mindset and its reliability to be able to shift course in such a dramatic way. What does that tell us? So maybe these two questions in one package. Anybody ready to take that one on?
Yeah, well, just to make, I thought I've answered that already, but no, the reasons for that change will not go away. So there's no reason why that could be turning back. And it was not that our security policy was sending helmets to Ukraine and that's it. It was spending more than any other nation next to the United States in economic support for Ukraine. I find, just to tell you this, Thomas, in this round, as a German lawmaker, I got noticed of thankfulness and respect from people in the Baltic states of German, acknowledging that German soldiers sent by the German Bundestag, not only feeling security issues for their partners east of them, but taking care of that within NATO. And at the same time, having reports, not a lot, but some, single incidents, but some, in my country, in Germany, where soldiers on the streets wearing uniform, German soldiers, were the object of insults in public. At the same time, does make me think about how we address and how we think about our security, our nation as a whole, and the future of our security. But we definitely did not come from a pacifist country that didn't know anything about security, not being part of NATO, just selling helmets to a full-fledged 100 billion tiger now. That is a misperception. We are in a particular point of history where, unfortunately, the Russian Federation decided to destroy the security system in Europe as it survived with all its deficits for the past decades after the Cold War. But it's gone now. It is destroyed and it will not come back. And that puts so much pressure, not only on the German government, but also other governments. Ask the people of Romania, ask the people of Poland, that we are together with our alliance, together with not only the European countries, but also the United States, are willing to take this task of rebuilding and building new a security system in Europe, where obviously the biggest country economic-wise of the alliance in Europe has to play a bigger part, a bigger role in taking more responsibility. That's what we are in this moment. Yeah.
Okay. Any taker? Maybe Mark Speich is just raising a hand on the question, and from appeasement to brinksmanship in a week.
Well, actually, I think we came in last minute, so it was not really a quick decision. I mean, at least when it comes to the question of excluding Russia from SWIFT, I mean, we had a point on Saturday when even Cyprus and Hungary had declared to support that, and Germany really came last. So I think that was not a quick decision. It was an absolutely necessary decision, but definitely not one that is leading to brinkmanship. It is leading to a deterrent posture, and I think that is absolutely necessary in the situation we are. And that, in a way, comes back to your question regarding the nuclear. I think it's not just about nuclear sharing. I think we will, and that is more a midterm consequence of what we are seeing right now, is that we will be in a situation where we will revisit Emmanuel Macron's speech at the École de Guerre, where he was speaking on the French nuclear deterrent as a nucleus, if you like, for a European approach. It's not about supporting all what he said, but entering a discourse on nuclear deterrent from a European perspective, I think, is something that will happen. It will also happen in the light of maybe of an US administration under a different leadership. So I think the course of events that we're observing now is also changing the discourse on nuclear weapons in Germany, and will change that. That is at least my personal perspective on that. And allow me a second, more midterm consequence that I see. I think we will also see a new discourse on the enlargement procedure of the European Union. I mean, we haven't been able to offer those countries around us a geopolitical stability by offering a status that is not full membership, but something beneath that. And I think we have to rethink enlargement procedures to offer this kind of geostrategic stability, also when it comes to the Western Balkans, for instance, because the world is a different one with this Russian aggression, and we have to take care. We have to care for that, also in organizing the West, if you like.
There's one question that corresponds with your remark, Mark Speich. That is, what about a snap accession of Ukraine to the European Union? Ms. von der Leyen had a more longer term but approving comment yesterday, but there is demands and questions from Ukraine, as is in our chat.
If I'm going to respond to that immediately, I mean, that's exactly the problem. The full membership comes with the whole complexity of the acquis, and it's from my perspective not foreseeable how to integrate the Ukraine in its current status into that kind of complexity of this kind of legal complexity. That is why I think we need to have a second status. I mean, it's an old idea, as you know, from Wolfgang Schäuble and Karl Lammers, who proposed this kind of concentric circles. I think we have to adapt that idea a little bit, but we need a new institutional structure here to offer a country like Ukraine an immediate accession, but not on the level of full membership. I think that is what we need right now. So there is no snap accession, I think, into the legal complexity that the EU has built up in the past decades.
If I can add to that, Thomas, I think we should be very careful with promises that then policymakers are not willing and able to hold. So while I think it is absolutely important to offer a European perspective to Ukraine, whatever that may mean, and in my view, it doesn't mean very soon full membership, just like Mark Speich said. So a political commitment to a country still in transformation, and there are remarkable successes, but it is not totally there yet. So this is also a question, once we hopefully have a settlement of the war, how Europe can support Ukraine even more in its transformation. But at the moment, I think the EU has to regain credibility with regards to its capacity to enlarge, because we have been dragging on and on year by year with the Western Balkan countries, where, for instance, Albania and North Macedonia have been waiting for so long and have met many conditions that they were asked to meet, and the negotiations haven't been opened. So I think the EU has to make very clear that it is willing to take steps, and on the other hand, develop a closer relationship with those countries in our neighborhood that are quite far away from actually being able to ask for membership. But I would always shy away from making big promises. I would rather offer very concrete action, what can be done. And we shouldn't forget, there is an association agreement for Ukraine, there is visa freedom or visa-free travel, and we can add more things. And there we will prove the European commitment to Ukraine and other countries. And I think that's really important to be done at the moment, rather than saying, years down the lane, there could be enlargement. I think what we now need is very, very practical steps.
Let's see whether the next steps of this war will wash away this type of incrementalism as other incremental steps have been washed away. I have 2 or 3 other bigger in the last 4 minutes that we have. So I would ask for quick questions. A couple of viewers asked, what about Gerhard Schröder? Where is he? What to do with him now? Okay, that's an answer too.
No, actually, I have a clear position on that, but I think it's quite easy for me representing the opposition here. But I think it's unsustainable to keep his office as a former chancellor if he doesn't denounce his proximity to Putin and the crawl on his honorary citizenship in Hannover. I really don't see the point in keeping an honor to Gerhard Schröder. I really don't see that point, but I think it's much easier for me to take this stance.
Let's leave it at that.
Well, no, I don't think so. I don't think it's easier for you than for anybody else. I think that relationship to a potential war criminal in the greatest military operation in Central Europe, it should not make a difference whether you're a member of the Social Democratic Party, the Christian Democratic Union, the Green Party, the FDP. So no, it's easy for you, Max Speich, as it is easy for everybody else under the Constitution of Germany.
Thank you, Metin. One thing we haven't mentioned, we're a transatlantic organization. I felt yesterday was a transatlantic moment because within 3-4 days, this chancellor put the transatlantic relationship on a new footing. We mentioned Europe. We didn't mention the United States on this. Was this a coincidence? Can anybody help me out on this one?
I did mention the US when I spoke about what he conveyed during the parliamentary speech. Nuclear sharing is one thing, armament purchases, and then the commitment to the NATO 2% goal. It's also a very strong recommitment, nothing new because the goal has been around since 2014, but Germany has been slow in moving towards meeting the goal, and there's now a very clear commitment to do that. So I think also in terms of energy provisions or energy security and diversifying energy sources, this is also something that has been very high on the transatlantic agenda, in particular given the criticism of Nord Stream 2 by the American side. You know, there was a compromise reached a summer ago, which I don't think made the US government happy at all. So I think now really the course correction that we have seen on the German side actually takes some of the contentious issues off the table.
Just one addition, that it was at this point, it was just a week before, it was a big issue in Washington about the nuclear sharing and planes that should be purchased by Germany, as there is a super big timing problem of deciding what plane and certifying them for that use. I think that was also a very important signal at this point, and very particular timing, coincidentally, because for the past 3 or 4 weeks, this was a super big issue in Washington.
Last question, big question, hopefully a short answer. We've kept 240 people constantly hostage for an hour here with our German course correction. Last question that is from the chat. Is the fact that the goal of German Russia policy is now, as Finance Minister Lindner put it in Parliament, isolation, any precursor, or does it give any hint or does it change anything with regard to German China policy?
Okay, I need to leave at 7, and you're asking the China question at 7.
Me
okay.
too.
But first of all, just really quick, we will see China not voting in any direction in the Security Council for the next 2 or 3 years, I expect. It is pretty scary for the Chinese government as well at what developed. If you look at third countries that have their particular position on sovereignty and what happened to Ukraine. So we'll see how this develops. I do not believe in the Russian-China big alliance, friendship, forever bloc. I don't see that. I believe that at a certain point, there will be some form of transformation within the Russian society. We see this already. We see this not only in the big cities, we see that in different generations. This will take longer than we all wish for, probably, but it is happening, and I have not given up. I've not given up for the people of Ukraine, but also not for the people of Russia.
That was a good final word. I apologize for having asked a big question with no time. I want to thank my colleagues. This was a collaboration of our offices in Paris and Washington and in Berlin, put together with time zone differences over the course of a night, with 240 of you signing on within minutes. So I want to thank all of you, and especially our three panelists. Thank you and good evening.